Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Holden and this is Transgressive Academia. In this series I hope to showcase, review, discuss, analyse novels, stories, fiction that falls into the transgressive genre. There are some great channels on YouTube that talk about transgressive fiction, such as Plagued by Visions, but if you've never come across transgressive fiction before, allow me to introduce it to you. It's a type of postmodernist fiction, although some of the texts we'll look at are from earlier, including the one we're looking at today. That which is transgressive was kind of coined and defined by Foucault as something that exists beyond the threshold, something that pushes the boundary, goes over the boundary even. And so when we're looking at transgressive fiction, we're looking at stories that have gone too far, basically, have surpassed boundaries and have taken things to the next level as far as being violent, disturbing, gross, taboo. Transgressive fiction does differ from things like extreme horror or splatterpunk and doesn't necessarily exist for the sake of being disgusting like some of the extreme horror books in that genre do. But they do have intellectual pursuits. They do exist for some reason to offer some kind of commentary. And that's kind of what we're going to look at here. But there are plenty of booktubers who explore extreme horror and splatterpunk. So there is a market for it and it is out there. However, today we're going to start at the very beginning with the novella that Foucault himself name-dropped in his book, A Preface to Transgression, which is The Story of the Eye by Georges Bataille. It really is a challenge to try and explain or articulate what Bataille's philosophy was. I mean, there isn't necessarily a Wikipedia page that we can go to look at kind of what he thought. He's not Sartre, he's not Camus. There does exist this base materialism concept that he made up, but I really don't want to try and wrap my head around that. That seems like a whole lot of work. And I think it's pretty clear that Story of the Eye is meant to be one of these literary puzzles like Gravity's Rainbow or Finnegan's Wake, but it is just so much more accessible than those texts. It's about 120 pages long, and I think everyone can have a crack at it, even if a lot of people are going to find they have a strong reaction to it, and that reaction might not be positive. In trying to understand Story of the Eye, a lot of people look to the epilogue or Bataille's notes at the end of the novella, in which he kind of talks about why. Why do any of this? And because this is transgressive academia, and because this is such a challenge, this novel, I've pulled out the sources. So let's take it in another direction and let's hear from some academics. Chateau Nasseri and Kian Sohail is, in their paper from 2014 on the subject, is something that I'm going to reference here. First place they look for inspiration in trying to understand Bataille's philosophy is what he says about his childhood and what he says about his father at the end of Story of the Eye. And yeah, if we turn to that back of the book, we turn to that notes from the author section, Bataille says, hey look, a lot of this masterpiece or mess, depending on how you look at it, was derived and directly inspired by my childhood and my experience with my father. And we learn that Bataille's father was not only blind but also suffering with this mental degradation, which I believe was caused by syphilis after looking into it. Bataille writes that he saw his father's condition rapidly deteriorate throughout his life, and there seems to be this reference to both this screaming and this laughter, to this agony and this euphoria. And it's this middle place, or it's this place where they both meet, that is the subject of Bataille's philosophy, I suppose. Nasseri and Sohail find this kind of meeting of pleasure and pain in Bataille's life and work to be significant. And they say this about the screams of Bataille's father and his laughter. They say they were the violators of the highest values of morality, dignified self and defined borders. They then go on to say that Bataille sought out these destructive experiences, which imply experiencing boundless freedom, freedom from language, discipline, morality, and so forth. In my mind, then, the argument is that Bataille was intentionally seeking out transgression, intentionally seeking out that space beyond the border, beyond the threshold, beyond pain, beyond pleasure. I suppose we could think of it like this, in that Bataille was trying to imagine or depict after the border, after the threshold. What does humanity look like after corruption, after morality, after God, after life. I guess you could say that Bataille saw his father lose everything, from his sight to his mobility to his dignity, perhaps even his life. Considering how much pain he was in his life, I wouldn't be surprised if his condition eventually killed him. And so I think it's that question of what lies beyond, what lies after, that Bataille is kind of chasing here. That sensation that perhaps he saw in his father, that space beyond pleasure, beyond pain. That, from what he says and what the scholars have said, seems to be where we begin to understand what he was trying to achieve here. Although it's still very cryptic, that's what I think is valuable for us at the moment. So this has been a very long and complicated preface to Story of the Eye, and I appreciate that. But I think now that we've set this up, we've set up kind of what is this novel trying to achieve. It is trying to achieve the sensation beyond the threshold. We can now kind of critically look at, well, what is actually this story about? So if you're unfamiliar with Story of the Eye, won't spoil anything here, but basically we follow two cousins who are also lovers, off to a great start. They're in their late teens and they kind of bond over what I guess we could call a shared sexual philosophy. I guess it's hard to explain what that philosophy is. I think the best way to describe it is that our kind of female protagonist here, Simone, is a paraphiliac, and her lover, the unnamed male narrator, is an accomplice to her sexual transgression. The paraphilias and the sexual transgressions kind of start off quite basic. Simone likes to sit in strange substances like milk and eggs, which, although is weird, is harmless. It then goes into things like urolagnia, which, if you're not familiar with what that is, you're free to Google that. We won't go into it here. But things do escalate throughout the novel until we see things like just non-consensual sex acts, and then eventually also homicide. As for the question of why any of this, Bataille does give us some answers in his epilogue, saying that some of these experiences were derivative from his own trauma growing up, but that's few and far between. I think there's a lot of room, a lot of space for us to develop our own analysis or understanding of what on earth he's trying to achieve here, and a lot of people have done great at that. But it's the kind of task that's going to take 2 or 3 or more reads in order for me to really quite articulate some nugget of brilliance for you. At this stage, this is just kind of my thoughts after reading it for the first time last month. And although I don't have all the answers for you today, I do acknowledge that there was an emotional and intellectual experience, connection almost. I acknowledge this text is trying to tell me or show me something. Don't know what it is yet, but the fact that I am so intrigued and wanting to find out, I think is the reason I feel that this is an important text. But, of course, Bataille does drop those clues, like I said, and those clues do point towards a psychoanalytical analysis of this, in which he acknowledges that, yes, my own trauma has played a role in creating the atmosphere of this novel. So I think we are best off examining that next. Bataille's use of symbolism is the place where we see his trauma on show most explicitly, I think. There's a lot of recurring symbols or motifs in this novel. For example, eggs, eyes, obviously, urine as well. And I think the eggs are probably the hardest one to explain. Bataille never drops a hint as to why eggs play such a large role in this story, and I don't really have a guess. Some people have really had a shot in the dark at it as far as what the eggs represent. The fact that they are kind of eye-shaped or testicular-shaped and therefore represent the eroticism of the novel. Sure, yeah, I don't feel super convinced. But I think particularly on the subject of trauma, I think the eyes have the most significance. In the epilogue, Bataille shares with the reader that the scene in his novel in which the couple witness a freak accident during a bullfight in which one of the bullfighter's eyes is severed by the horn of a bull is actually inspired by something he saw in his childhood. Something that kind of stuck with him, which makes sense because that would have been really quite traumatic. Probably not forget that in a hurry. Because of the way trauma works, we understand trauma to be something that is present. People who experience trauma are currently affected by something that happened in the past. For example, it's different from a memory, in which a memory we understand that happened in the past. It doesn't affect me now. It's over. We're moving on. Trauma is always current. It's always with us, where it's always kind of affecting how we live now. The thing with trauma, though, is it can manifest itself in different ways as well. It's not always remembered or experienced as terror. It can also be experienced as eroticism. That experience of heightened emotions of horror and disgust from earlier in life may stick around. And it looks like in Bataille's case, did stick around as this erotic feeling instead of this feeling of horror. And I think that phenomenon is also part of Story of the Eye, and this place in which trauma, horror, eroticism meet. I want to switch to this paper from 2000 by Jonathan Bolter called The Negative Way of Trauma, that explores this topic of trauma and sexuality and eroticism in Story of the Eye. Bolter cites Freud's understanding of trauma theory, which is as being evidenced by a form of repetition, compulsion to traumatize individuals, which they return, one may almost say nostalgically, to the scene of trauma in dreams, memories, transference, and actions. Which I find interesting, because you'll notice that the actions, these sexual transgressions committed by Simone and the narrator, are done in this way, are done in this compulsive repetition. Simone and the narrator tend to just do these things, do this sexual transgression and debauchery because I have to, because I need to. There is one scene in the text in particular that I think this is evident of this kind of traumatic repetition. And a quick content warning, because the content in this novel is quite disturbing in general, but this particularly so. So just a heads up. But there is this one scene in which Simone and the narrator find their childhood friend Marcel hanged in her closet, and they take the body down and they kind of lay it on the ground, I believe, and then they have intercourse for the first time beside the body. And after that, Simone desecrates the corpse. There's a lot going on. I appreciate that. But it's not very Sard. Sard would have written this scene a very different way, in which it's clear that this is sexy. Not necessarily erotic, but like, this is hot, like this turns me on, and that thus I write it. But for Bataille, I think the intention seems to be very different, and that is very much communicated by what happens next. After Simone desecrates the body of Marcel, the narrator says this: "As for the fact that Simone dared to, whether in boredom or at worst in irritation, it mainly goes to prove how impossible it was for us to understand what was happening, and of course, it is no more understandable today than it was then." So it's not necessarily I do this because it's hot, I do this because it turns me on, but it's I do this because, I don't know, because I can, maybe? The narrator isn't sure. He doesn't know if it's boredom, irritation, or perhaps even this third thing, this understanding of our own autonomy and of our own freedom. It reminds me a lot of Camus' protagonist in The Outsider, shooting the Arab on the beach. Why does he do it? Well, why not? I could, so I did. And that's precisely the thing. This isn't the first or last time Simone would act in this transgressive, act in this deplorable way. This way that seems to be erotic somehow, and there's the implication that it brings pleasure, but never explicitly said the same way it would be in a Sard novel, perhaps. But it is very much the repetition and the compulsive repetition of these actions. Simone is always sitting in eggs. Simone is always urinating on things. Simone is always trying to take things to the next level, over and over again on every page for 120 pages. That, I think, cements that this book is ultimately about trauma, and the way that our trauma can manifest itself in ways that we don't like and turn us into people we don't wish to become. Whether the novel is trying to teach us something about our trauma, or whether the novel is just kind of a cathartic experiment Bataille to explore his own trauma, I don't know. Could be both. Could be neither. The truth about Story of the Eye is that this isn't a very pleasant read. It's quick, it's easy, The translations that are available from French are really quite comprehensive and really quite good. No complaints. I think if you are morbidly curious, or if you want the challenge, or if you're up for the puzzle of it, I think it's worth having a look at. Although it is not pleasant. That is probably the warning I would give. And it's not fun either. But plenty of people like the philosophy of it. Plenty of people like the challenge of it. Plenty of people just know that it's weird and they just want to see how weird it can get. And it gets weird, so if you're in it for that, you won't be disappointed. I think the story of the eye really just gives as much as you're willing to put into it. If you're willing to sit there for ages and think about it, you'll find that it keeps giving. There's more layers to it. There's more to understand and experience. At the same time, not really a beach read. So if you can't dedicate the time to thinking too hard about it, you may find that you just throw your hands in the air and say, what did I just read? Which is a valid response as well. I'm sure Bataille anticipated that some people were just going to think he was crazy for all of this. But the good thing about Story of the Eye is that there's plenty of people who have talked about this novel to death. Plenty of resources out there for people who want to understand it even more. I've linked some good ones in the description, so have a look. But that's all from me for today. Thank you for joining me. This was fun, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.